Before George Floyd's tragic murder at the hands of Minneapolis police was captured on videotape by a teenage bystander in May of 2020, the 1991 brutal attack by LA police officers on another unarmed black man, Rodney King, captivated the nation. Mr. King's attack, the lack of accountability by the criminal justice system, and decades of inequities erupted on the streets of LA in April of 1992 in what some call a riot, others dub civil unrest of 1992, and some simply call black rage of millions of African Americans who were sick and tired of being sick and tired. On the anniversary of Rodney King's death, we are asking the tough questions about his life and legacy, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
It was March 3rd, 1991, literally 30 years ago, when plumber George Holliday was asleep in his LA apartment when he heard a loud commotion outside. He grabbed his video camera and walked to his balcony. With a hovering LAPD helicopter spotlight providing illumination, the scene Holliday captured changed history. He recorded 4 white LAPD officers using batons, tasers, feet, and fists to brutally beat a black man later identified as Rodney King. Mr. King was pulled over for speeding. The traffic stop quickly devolved into a violent assault on an unarmed black man, an assault so brutal that it left Mr. King with skull fractures, broken bones, and teeth and permanent brain damage. The video was provided to a local LA news station, and then seen around the world, it led to calls for the ouster of the then LA Police Chief Daryl Gates. The 4 officers involved were eventually criminally prosecuted, but later acquitted by a predominantly white jury in a white suburb outside of LA. What followed was the largest protest movement in LA history and decades-long conversations on race, policing, and the criminal justice system. Today, we are talking to Mr. King's daughter, activists, and historians on how the beating of Rodney King and the aftermath changed Los Angeles and the world. My first guest is Lora King. She is the daughter of Rodney King and the founder and CEO of the Rodney King Foundation. Good morning, Lora.
Good morning. How are you today?
I'm great, and thanks so much for joining us. Thank you for
My
just
pleasure.
being willing to sit down and have this conversation. We are coming upon the anniversary of your dad's death, and we just had the 30-year anniversary of the tragic incidents that led to his beating and the civil unrest that we saw in Los Angeles. I just want to talk a little about how that entire encounter played out for you and your family, because I know you were just 7 years old when your father was brutally beaten by the Los Angeles Police Department. Did your mom or your family talk about it much to you, at the time that it was happening when you were just a little girl?
It's so crazy that you asked that question. I think the world was so in shock that unfortunately that's all people talked about. And my mom tried to shield me, but still, it was like still everybody was talking about it. And so everywhere I went, people talked about it. So it was like no escaping it.
Did you ever, as a
Yeah,
little girl, see the video? Did you watch the video, or did your mom try to shield you from watching the video that kept getting played over and over again?
She tried, but everywhere I went, it was always there. So unfortunately, I watched it over and over again, because even if it wasn't at home, no matter where I went, people were watching it. So it was like,
Yeah. I've watched some videos and some interviews that your dad did after the beating. And, he talked about how painful it was for him to relive it.
right.
And, just the trauma that he
Yeah.
experienced and the aftermath of it. What was it like for your family? Like you said, everywhere you go, people talking about it, this video being played, those pictures of his brutality being, just splashed across the media. How challenging was that for you and your family?
And I wanted to say something. I'm glad earlier that you mentioned permanent brain damage, because a lot of people look at it as like, oh, he lost his mind after that. But if you look at what permanent brain damage, a lot of your life, matter of fact, your life will never be the same. Permanent. It's not temporary. So permanent means that affects all areas of your life. And my dad was really strong. He was like beyond strong. And I would say that even if he wasn't my dad. So he would hide a lot of the times where he was in pain. Most of the time he was in pain, physical, emotionally, mentally, and trying to still raise 3 girls. I couldn't imagine. And we never had intimate moments. You know, it was like when we were out to dinner, we wanted our time, and people would always come up and say things, and he was so patient. And we would be the ones upset, like, oh my God, this is our time. He was so just polite, answer questions, smile. And it was like, now that I'm of this age, I don't know how he did that. I don't. Yeah. As a human being, because I have bad days, but at the end of the day, I can go out and, you know, nobody knows me. He would have bad days, and you have to deal with that emotionally, and then you have to still address the world. I couldn't imagine that. That makes me look at him even more different. You know, it's like, wow. And you know, he wasn't offered counseling. I think someone that goes through something like that, they should have lifelong counseling. It's like, okay, money is not it, you know, and $3 million, that's not a lot of money. And when half of it goes to attorneys and half of them goes to child support and half of it goes to wives, it's really not. Mentally, it's a lot to process for a human being. And I would say that even if he wasn't my dad, I would say that if George Floyd, God forbid, lived, I would say the same thing. You know, it's just unfortunate.
And I'm glad, Laura, that you bring that up, because oftentimes people, and you mentioned the $3 million, you're making reference to the civil suit that your dad later filed against the LAPD, and he was awarded, I think it was like $3.8 million in that civil lawsuit.
Right.
And oftentimes people hear what appears to be these large sums of money, either in a settlement or a civil suit, and they think, oh my God, you know, they're rich, or, you know, look at all this money, and they don't realize, as you said, and I'm a lawyer, so, you know, a large portion of it goes to the attorneys. So that's true. And then, you know, there are other expenses that have to be paid out of that money. But at the end of the day, the money doesn't change the brutality.
What happened?
Or in the cases of those people that have lost their lives, the fact that someone has died as a result of that kind of police violence. So I'm so glad that you put that in perspective, because it's not like hitting the lotto and you're alive and you're well and you're happy and you're excited. This is not that kind of money. This is not that at all.
And even though my dad didn't die, you know, even though he didn't die that night, we never got a 70% of him back ever again. My dad was never the same. And he smiled. Everybody that knows him knew he smiled, but he was broken. Everything you can think of, he was that. And he tried to be strong. And it's like, a big part of him died that night that we never got back, you know?
Wow. You know, one of the things we see, Laura, happen in these high-profile police brutality cases is the demonizing of the victim. You know, we've seen that with George Floyd. He's a drug addict. He was, you know, addicted to heroin and meth, and you know, they demonize the victims. So when you read a lot of stories about your dad, you see a lot of that happening too. You know, the emphasis some media place on, you know, like a prior arrest record that he had, or, you know, other infractions involving the law. How does that make you feel, you know, as his daughter, describing what is such a wonderful man who you knew as a father, who was loving and kind and giving? When you read those accounts where, you know, they try to shift the focus away from that attack and somehow suggest that, you know, because he maybe had some involvement with the law, that he was somehow deserving of what happened to him, because that's really what they're saying. You know, that's the code in that kind of language.
Exactly.
How does that make you feel when you hear that?
Yeah. There's no, like my church says, there's no justification on injustice. That you can't, there's nothing you can say to convince me, because at the end of the day, that's a human being and they don't deserve that. And their job is protect and serve, not protect and brutalize, not protect and kill. So I have an issue with that. You know, it's just like, it's really unfortunate. And, you know, during the trial of my dad's case, they said that he was on PCP. They said this. What was a proven fact, as well as studies, the case came out that particular night, it was negative. Now, was he drinking? Yes. Did he smoke marijuana? Yes. Was he high on PCP? No, he wasn't. They were intimidated because my dad was like 6'3". big guy. He was huge. You know, people I can't, it's how I look. That doesn't justify a beating, you know, and it's like, it's really unfortunate. Now, after the fact, yeah, he struggled with things, but who wouldn't? Dealing with that, and you have to relive that every single day of your life. And you know, one of the things he told me before he passed, he said, you have to find your own normal. And I didn't understand that until every year he passed. I get it. You do have to find your own normal, because people will put you in a category. It's like, you know, it's like George Floyd's daughter. She says, and no matter what we feel, no matter what the world feels, her dad was who her dad was to her. And to me, that's the most beautiful thing, because she knows who her dad was before the world knew him. And now she can, when she gets older, that's something that will carry her. It's not like she was younger, so now she has to be forced to figure out who he was. She knew him. And regardless of what they painted the picture, she knew him. And to me, that's very memorable, because she's gonna have to carry that. And I was the same age she was. So for me, it's really emotional, because she has to go through her entire life watching this video. She can't escape it. You can be in a party, she's gonna be, you know, anywhere, and they're gonna bring it up, and you have to hold those emotions in. And that's a tough thing. That's a tough thing to do. It really is.
That is so powerful. You know, I interviewed Eric Gardner's daughter. I have
She's
her
a
on
friend
my.
of mine. Yes.
Oh, okay. Well,
We became
as you're
friends.
talking, I'm getting chills, because I'm
Yes.
thinking about her. And you know,
Yes.
I interviewed her after
Emerald.
her sister had died. And
Yes.
you know, the older sister, and she had taken on her sister's kids. And she
Yes.
was just talking about the trauma, and how she felt like that trauma led to her sister's premature death,
Yeah,
because she could,
absolutely.
everywhere she went, you know, Eric
Yep.
Gardner, and you know, they
Yep.
never had a chance to grieve privately,
It's
and never
true.
deal with the just the
Yep.
incredible trauma of losing their dad, and then him becoming, you know, this bigger than
Yep.
life figure. But oh yeah, so I'm just sitting here having chills, thinking as you're talking about George's daughter.
Yeah.
Yes, what her
And that's
life.
a powerful statement. She, Emerald and I actually became soul sisters, because we did a panel last year after George Floyd's murder, and we became really close friends. And it's just like, I just think about, like you said, after all the lights and all that, I'm still going through grieving. It's 9 years, and I can't even look at my dad's picture for longer than 5 seconds. I still can't, because it's hard for me to process. Plus, I'm still trying to process my life, and then him not being here, and then this happening again, and they repeating his name over and over, and I have to hold those emotions in. And usually I'm okay, but now I'm thinking about his daughter, and she was the same age I am, and she has to go through her entire life. This is going to be her life. And it's something you can't escape. You can't turn it on and off. It's something that you have to ask God. Sometimes her mom is not even going to be able to comfort her. That's something that God is going to have to strengthen her, because sometimes you can't. You want to tap out because it's too much. So I just really, I commend her. I commend her, because she's strong spirited. So I just wish her the best. I
I'm
do.
I'm so glad you and Emerald connected. I just
Yes.
love to hear that. There's so
Yes.
many, you know, you guys are in
Yes.
unfortunately a club. You didn't choose to be
Right.
in it. You didn't choose
Right.
it, but you know, having each other can, you know, provide so much strength. I just want to ask you, what went through your mind when you saw the George Floyd video? Because your dad's video 30 years earlier captivated the nation. As you said, your dad didn't die. And then 30 years later, we see this video of George Floyd. Uh, what went through your mind when you saw that video as an adult? Because now you're a full grown adult. You've lived through other police, you know,
Right.
cases, other high profile cases. But there's something, you know, obviously was so unique about what we saw in your dad's video and what we saw in the George Floyd video.
You know, I'd like to use my dad's quote is, can we get along? But the question is obviously not. And another one is, can we be equal? If we all closed our eyes and heard each other from our hearts, judge on that. But you're judging us based off the color of our skin. That's true ignorance to me. That's really ignorant. You know, and it's sad because it's generational curses, because their grandparents and their, but instead of judging from, you know, this point, you want to judge for, well, my grandparents said black people. It's, at the end of the day, it's really unfortunate, and it's really sad, because we should be the land of the free, and yet we're still not, because we're still slaves mentally, because it's like, it's just really sad. It's actually really sad. I'm very hopeful. I have, hope the side of a mustard seed, because more people are more involved now. More people are fed up because there's more interracial couples. There's more people that have, Black bloodline. So not only that, Black people as a friends. So now they're affected and they see the trauma. But it's sad that if it doesn't directly affect you, it's not a problem. No, we're in America, so this is an American problem. It should be, like for example, when they were looting and doing all these things, it was a state of emergency. They sent troops and this and that. But why can't a Black man's life be the state of emergency? Why? Yeah. Why isn't that important? And they wonder why people are looting, because it's like a toddler. When you whoop a toddler, but you cover her mouth, like, I'm screaming for help me. I'm watching my dad die. I'm watching my brother die. And yet people are just at home watching the news like, what'd they do? Popping popcorn. Like, oh, it's sad. No, that's sad. That's really sad that 30 years, I'm 37 and we're still here.
Yeah, no, it's got to be so frustrating for you. I know you've become this amazing advocate around police violence. You started this foundation. Were you involved? Have you been participating in any of the protests following George Floyd's murder? Has that been a part of your journey as an advocate?
That's great you asked that. It's so hard for me. Like, it's really emotional because it's like, and I don't want to like break down in front of people. So, I think I went to one at Venice Beach last year. And I went, but other than that, I kind of stay home. But I have a son. He actually just turned 2 last week. Oh. So he was a baby last year. So I kind of didn't want to, be out and about. But, I was in Zoom meetings. I was like doing diversity training. I've done a couple, I flew to San Francisco with the San Francisco Police Department, and they have an amazing program. Basically, they're reconstructing everything, which if they have a domino effect, imagine where we can be. But everybody's not willing to take that step. So I'm just grateful for them that they actually stepped out on faith and took that leap to see where could we grow? Where could we learn from? Let's have uncomfortable conversations so that we could grow.
So Lora, here we are almost on the 9-year anniversary of your dad's death. We've gone through this summer of unrest, after George Floyd's murder. And I know your dad said in an interview that he had forgiven the cops that beat him. And he asked us in that passionate plea to all try to get along. What do you think your dad would say if he were alive today about the state of policing in this country?
I think he would say the same thing. It's unfortunate. Why do we have to suffer? Because the color of our skin? That's pure ignorance to me. If that's the only reason you have to beat someone, kill someone, and go home and eat a steak, that's honestly is psychotic. I think police officers, like my dad would say, they need to be reevaluated because they're exposed to different things and they become a different person. So they need to be reevaluated. Don't swear them in, evaluate them, and then let them go, and take their reports seriously. Don't rip it up and go on to the next. And then when they're on trial, then we find out all this rap sheet about them. It's unfortunate, and it hurt my dad's heart. I believe Trayvon Martin died the same year. And I remember TMZ caught him at the airport and he was devastated because he said, I know what it's like to cry for basically your life, and yet it's not taken serious. It's like, that's sad. That man was crying for his mom, and his mom is deceased. He was begging those people. He was begging that man to get off of him. And he begged, and it just hurts me because he was dead when they put him on the gurney. And it was like, no big deal. That's psychotic to me. It really is.
Just last question for you, Lora. You've described your dad. You've told us what a big heart he had and how, what a wonderful man he was. On this, coming up on the anniversary of his death, what's the one thing you want us to remember your dad for that perhaps the media, hasn't, shown a spotlight on or hasn't talked about?
My dad was so spontaneous. Like, parents are not supposed to show up for, when you go on a camping trip for the weekend. he would drive all the way there, come get all this baseball stuff, play with the kids. Of course, because who he was, they let him. And it was like, what are you doing here? Like, he was the guy that came to back to school night and sat in the front row and took notes. You know, he was a humble man. And to me, when you're humble, and he was nice looking, so it was like crazy because women will always say stuff to us and it's like, oh my gosh, but he didn't think of it that way. He was a very humble man, and like, he put everybody before him. You know, he would show up to parks and, you know, pay for the park so the park doesn't get closed. It's like, at the end of the day, he sacrificed so much. He sacrificed our future because who he was. And to me, you know, we look at success as this and that, and I think success is what you give back. Despite of what you're hurting, use your pain to push you. And that's what I do, because that's what he did. And I saw him do that. So it's only right for me to demonstrate, to use your pain to push you.
Well, you're doing an amazing job. And I know your dad is looking down from heaven, smiling on you and the work that you're doing. You are representing his legacy so incredibly well.
Thank you.
Good luck to you in all of your endeavors. Keep being a bright light. Keep,
Thank you so much.
Speaking the truth. Keep reminding us about what we need to do to change the way we treat Black men and women in this country, particularly as it relates to the police and, community policing, and, just keep being a bright light. I just love what you're doing, and I can feel your passion, and I'm just so happy for you.
Can I say one more thing before I forget?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. And we have a million things that we're doing, but one of the things that's dear to my heart is the I Am King Scholarship. And we launched that a year and a half ago. And it's in light of African-American men, because the media has this thing where they portray them as bad dads, upset. And I'm like, I know plenty of great dads. Both of my kids' fathers are amazing fathers. And I started it because I wanted to get down to basically self-esteem, because we suffer from this and that, but the core issue is self-esteem. And that is having a father figure. I'm a mom, and I say this, a father is the most important person in a kid's life, because that's their foundation. That's a girl's first love. That's a boy's first example. So we want to basically fund a day out for a father, and he doesn't have to take out of his household. He can fund a day out and spend quality time without the phone, without this and that, just undivided attention. When we get undivided attention from our father, we become unstoppable. So I want to encourage you guys to go to rodneyking.org and sign up, donate, let us know your feedback. But that's something that's dear to my heart, and I was just wanted to let you guys know.
Thank you for sharing that. Again, it's Lora King.
welcome.
She's the founder and CEO of the Rodney King Foundation. We'll do everything we can to get the word out and spread the word about that scholarship program that you run and your foundation. So look for something from the special report, because we're going to definitely support you in that effort. Again, thank you so much, Lora. My best.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, great. All right, Lora King, what an example. She said, let your pain, push through, or allow you to push through. And so many people have turned their pain into passion. I want to bring on my next guest. Her name is Reverend Dr. Najuma Smith-Pollard. She's the program manager for the USC Cecil L. Murray Center for Civic Engagement. And she's also the pastor of Word of Encouragement Community Church. She's a friend of mine. She was a newly minted minister in 1992 at First AME Church of LA, which was the epicenter of so much that happened following the beating of Rodney King. Good morning and welcome, Reverend Smith-Pollard, Najuma, my friend. Just so happy to see you.
It's good to see you too, Areva. Thank you for having me. You can just call me Reverend Najuma. We can keep the formalities low.
Reverend Najuma.
And I wanted to say that to just, shout out to Lora, and you could definitely feel her pain and her passion as a mother who's lost a son, and, just to the street violence. I understand what she means. You have to turn your pain into a push and to a passion. And so just sending you much love, Lora. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Reverend Najuma, for sharing that. Yeah, you're such a strong and incredible example. Thank you for sharing the story about your own son. My heart goes out to you. Of course, I knew your son. We grew up in church together. So, my heart breaks for you. But I just admire what you've been able to do with Pastor Murray. You were you even a minister in 1992?
I was not a minister. I had not declared ministry yet, but I was hanging around the ministers. But I was very active at that time in 92. I was in at least 6 or 7 different auxiliaries to include the choir. So I was right up under Pastor Murray and Pastor Mark, and a bunch of other ministers at that time, but I had not declared ministry yet. I declared the next year.
Help us understand, Reverend Najuma, what it was like, the day that the verdict came down in Simi Valley in that criminal trial when those 4 officers were acquitted. What was it like being, a Black woman living in South Los Angeles at First AME Church? What was that like?
It was like a whirlwind. And I tell people all the time, like, it wasn't as if Pastor Murray sent out a mass text, on the day of the verdict. Pastor Murray had prepared us. He had spent months preparing the congregation, the community, with meetings. Unfortunately, Daryl Gates never came to any of those meetings, but that's a whole other conversation. And it's something actually I shared with Chief Moore recently. He had prepared us as a congregation and a community. So the day of the verdict, when it kind of went out on the news, like the verdict is going to be read, everybody flooded to First AME. So before the verdict was read, First AME was flooded with people, with cameras. And as the night went on after the verdict and the explosion happens in our city, people see that picture of Fame that was just put up. But just imagine there being like thousands of people inside and thousands of people outside, cameras. It was not mayhem because Pastor Murray had us organized, but it was just an overwhelming rush of pain, anger, frustration, disbelief. Like we were like really crying, like, did that just happen? And, but Pastor Murray had prepared us with what to do next. And what we knew to do was to get to the church. And then he took it from there and led us through a service that helped all of us kind of figure out what we were going to do next. And, for me, I just got more engaged in ministry, more engaged with the church. But Pastor Murray was very clear about what needed to happen, that the church had to step up at that critical hour and really and so Fame became that epicenter. And, when I talked to my big brother, your brother, Mark, that next day he left his day job and Fame Renaissance was birthed the next day, and for those that are not familiar, Fame Renaissance became the nonprofit arm for Fame, where all of the grants and funding and jobs funnel through. That all happened and it moved really quick, really fast. We were at the church for at least 2 months, every day, all day, for at least 2 months. Yeah.
And so, Reverend Najuma, I know back then there's so much coverage, and I'm purposely not showing those photographs because we know back then the media just focused on, the looting, people going into stores and the burning. Help us understand how the media just got that wrong and what wasn't focused on that should have been focused on instead of those pictures of, people with tennis shoes in their hands.
Absolutely. What should have been focused on were the number of men and women that were in the streets trying to try to, keep individuals from hurting themselves and hurting others. What should have been on the media's radar were the men of Fame, and not just Fame, other churches also rallied together that were out there literally on the streets. Like, we talk about being in the streets now as if in 92, we weren't in the streets. We were in the streets. We were in the streets before it became popular. Now it's popular to say I'm in these streets, but we were in those streets from that night on. And so the media missed it because all they showed was the looting, which then creates an image that all Black and Latino people do is loot when they're upset. No, we rally. We have vigils. We pray. People were praying. Because at that time I was living on 93rd and Avalon. When I drove through my community, I saw looting, but I also saw people praying on the streets. I also saw people giving out food. People were just doing what they could to bring peace and love to the moment because everyone was so hurt. And that's where the media got it wrong. There were a number of different churches that had gatherings. Fame was one of them, of course, but they missed it. They should have showed those images more than what they showed because it really portrayed an image globally that all Black people were doing were tearing up stores.
Yeah.
That's just not what was happening. Yeah.
And, unfortunately, 30 years later, we see that still today when we have protests after one of these big, the profile shootings, or there's a verdict or something,
Right.
there's so much emphasis, intensity and focus on the negative, and not enough on what you just described as the Black and brown people who were in those streets,
Absolutely.
doing good, and really encouraging people to
Absolutely.
find ways to vent their hostility in a way that would be more positive. You mentioned, Reverend Najuma, the Renaissance Center, and Pastor Mark Woodlock, and yourself, and so many other ministers under the leadership of Reverend Cecil Murray, who is an icon in this community and really across the nation.
Yeah.
Help us understand what the goal of the Renaissance Center was in terms of trying to rebuild South LA, and tell us, was it successful?
It was very successful. So the goal of the Renaissance was really because what ended up happening, because Fame became the epicenter, resources and opportunities flooded through the church. And so, of course, you got to have nonprofit to make sure that things go right. So Renaissance became that nonprofit arm where millions of dollars from Disney and DreamWorks and banks, I have to remember the list. Like, banks were giving money because what needed to happen, let me say this way, to rebuild LA, and we're still rebuilding. Be very clear for those that are watching. LA has actually, South LA and Compton and Watts and other parts of the city has still yet to be fully rebuilt after the civil unrest. And that's not because people don't want their cities to be rebuilt. It's because resources have not been abundant. But we do so what Renaissance did was became a portal, if you will, for resources and jobs. Organizations were giving out, scholarships and things like that. Even my son's father, at the time, my oldest son now, father, he was able to take advantage of a Vidal Sassoon scholarship. So scholarships were being given out. I know we were busing hundreds of students to Disney for jobs and Knott's Berry Farm. And so Renaissance became that place where all of those resources, all of those jobs, all those opportunities, trainings were done. There was a program for water conservation and transportation. I mean, you name it. And then not to mention the housing projects that sprouted up as a result, where Fame bought property in the area and they were able to do low income housing and some micro lending for small businesses. So it really became an oasis, if you will, for South LA that really just blessed the community. And that's what the community needed. We didn't need more police. We needed more resources, and we still need that today.
Yeah. My last question for you is, here we are 30 years later, still talking about Rodney King, and can't talk about Rodney King without talking about George Floyd, and talking about the long list of other Black men and women that have lost their lives to police violence. Are you, hopeful that the next 30 years we won't be having this conversation, and we won't have to talk about a long list like we're doing today?
Yeah, I think what the silver lining with the Chauvin outcome in the case, let me say it that way, is that when people continue to stand up against this kind of injustice, we begin to see a shift and a change. Now, Chauvin's conviction came 30 years too late. So hopefully, I'm hopeful that the next 30 years, we will see a quicker shift in the pattern, that when law enforcement acts unjustly, that there will be swifter, more frequent accountability. So we're not 30 years from today and it's only been one conviction or two, right? When there may have been hundreds of violations. And so that's what I'm hopeful about, is that it took 30 years to get where we are today, which is really too late. But it's also a sign that there's a very slow shift happening, and we got to keep our foot on the gas. We have to keep advocating. We have to keep staying in these streets. We have to keep meeting with law enforcement. We got to keep working with our governments. We got to keep changing policy. We have to get more Black and brown people in office and writing legislation, all those things. We have to have more foundations like the one Lora is leading to really bring about a change so that when law enforcement acts unjustly, we get swifter accountability. That has to happen. And then, of course, we also need to see more and more resources poured into communities that have been ravished and left for dead, basically. Yeah.
I'm glad you are hopeful, Reverend Najuma. You know, it's unfortunate because every time we pick up the newspaper or turn on the TV, there's some report. The 17-year-old
Right.
kid just beat in the
Yes.
Glendale, mall by
Right.
police. Minneapolis, as the verdict was being read
Right.
in Chauvin, there were
Right.
shootings of Black folks in Minneapolis. So
Yeah.
we're going to end your interview on that positive note because we want
I'm
some
hopeful.
positive.
I don't say I don't know if it's gonna happen right away, but in 30 years, we should God help us if we don't see it, some kind of change.
Well, you're
Yeah.
part of that change, and we're glad to have you at the
Absolutely.
helm of that USC Center, working along with our beloved Reverend Murray.
Yes.
And thank you for all the work that the both of you are doing. Give my best to our pastor, give our
I
best to
will.
our
I
brother
will.
Mark, and keep being a bright light in our community. Really appreciate you, and good sitting down with you, my friend.
Absolutely. Thank you, Areva, so much. Have a blessed day. Thank you.
All right. Okay. We're talking about history here, and we can't have a conversation about history without talking to historians. That's who my next two guests are. Professor Brenda Stevenson. She is a professor of history at UCLA and an internationally recognized scholar on race, slavery, gender, and racial conflict. She is the author of multiple books, including The Contested Murder of Latasha Harlins, Justice, Gender, and the Origins of the LA Riots. Also joining me this morning is Dr. Gaye Teresa Johnson. She is a professor of Chicana, and African American Studies at UCLA. She too is the author of several books, including Spaces of Conflict, Sounds of Solidarity, Music, Race, and Spatial Entitlement in Los Angeles. Good morning.
Good morning.
I guess it's safe to say UCLA is in the house. So, okay. UCLA, Dr. Stevenson and Gaye, or Dr. Johnson, that you've told me to call you Gaye. Help us put into, some kind of historical context what we witnessed 30 years ago. We heard Pastor Najuma say she hopes that the next 30 years are different. But, something had to happen for us to get to where we were 30 years ago with Rodney King. So I'll ask you, Gaye, to start us off in terms of helping us understand what was going on in South LA leading up to that beating and then the civil unrest that we saw in 1992.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. There is just such an incredible history in Los Angeles, which is what makes it such an important city to study. As a kind of microcosm of what goes on with uprising, organizing, and police violence across the nation and truly across the world. A lot has gone on in Los Angeles with regards to uprising and race. And we had in the 1960s some of the most important uprisings. But then, we have, by the time of this incredible and historic case, so much had unraveled in terms of the infrastructures that had been created by community groups, and yet they were still there. But the incredible escalation of police violence and surveillance just reached this incredible tipping point. I think really, really important thing to mention, though, is that when we see a video like the one of Rodney King being so viciously assaulted by police officers, for Black people and for Brown people in Los Angeles, this was not simply a moment that was unraveling or unfolding in real time. This is a brief visibilizing of historical trauma that was long witnessed and also experienced, of course, by so many people in South LA. But it was also an affirmation of things to come, unfortunately, because it's not for Black people when they watch a video like this, and all of the ones that have succeeded it and continue to unfold as we go forward. It is not the end of something. It is merely a visibilizing of the ongoing conditions and structural oppression that Black people face in urban areas and all over the world. So I think that's a really important point to make here.
And help us, Dr. Stevenson, understand who Latasha Harlins was, and how the case of Latasha Harlins plays into what we saw erupt on the streets in Los Angeles in 1992.
Well, this was a young woman, young girl. She was 15 years old. She was a freshman at Westchester High School, and she had been killed in a grocery/liquor store in South Los Angeles about 10 days after the Rodney King beating, and actually 13 days after the Rodney King beating. And her the person who killed her, who was convicted of voluntary manslaughter in the case, was given no jail time after she was found guilty, and after the recommendation before the court from the probation officer was that this person, who was Soon Jadu, be given the maximum, which was 16 years in prison. And so this case became also a really glaring indication of the inequality of Black people before the law, and that Black life could be lost not just by, policemen at the hands of policemen, but of ordinary citizens. And that person or those citizens could be found guilty, and still justice could not be had. And so her name and the loss of her life, the tragic loss of her life, became again emblematic, symbolic of what we all had to fear and what we all had to mourn in our society, which is the loss of Black life, the loss of Black innocence without any accountability.
Professor Johnson, help us understand, there's terminology, words matter. And depending on who you're reading or who you're listening to, what happened in April of 1992 is described by some as civil unrest. It's described by others as the worst race riots, in the history of this country. Help us understand what's the best way or the most appropriate way from your vantage point to frame what happened.
Well, I think the first thing, and this is a very important question, is to understand how representation is used against Black people as a weapon. This is a way that narratives are rewritten to tell a story, not just about an event that is unfolding, but also about an entire people, and to justify the further demonization and trauma of Black people. And so this is not an exception. It has been obviously so much talk about the rage that Black people felt. There was a lot of questioning about why Black people would then turn in on their own neighborhoods, as if there was no understanding, and there wasn't really in a sort of mainstream way, of the ways that Black people were not allowed to leave that area, that they were blocked in by police, the ways that cities are constructed so that the freeways literally block in that area. The lack of transportation that allows people who are service workers and other kinds of workers to get on the bus and go 12 miles in less than 3 hours. I mean, these are all ways that people contain Black bodies, the way they also dispossess them. There was no conversation really in the mainstream about the ways that Black people owned very little of the neighborhood that they were a part of, and yet encountered, as longtime residents, some of the worst oppression in the world. And some of the representations that have been narrated by Black people since then have told us a different story about the long history of police brutality and also the lack of opportunities. But another thing that gets missed that I think is much more important, actually, in addition to understanding how representation is used against us as Black people, is the ways that Black people organized. And this is what the Reverend was just telling us about, was that the overwhelming picture that we get of South LA in the aftermath of the Rodney King assault and beating is one of Black bodies, Black people out of control, when in fact there were important truces that were created by not just gang members, but longtime community leaders who were drawing on a history of organizing and strategy and networks and relationships that they had already established over many decades. And so many things were proposed, so many strategies were created to combat things that were not just about police violence, but that police violence was representative of poverty, the lack of support for people who had been victims of AIDS, after school programs, breakfast programs, things that were addressing the whole and nurturing tradition of Black people that Black people have always been so good at. And so there was there's no surprise that Black churches were in many respects on the forefront of this. This is what gets missed. It's a completely different story than the one that we get told.
Yeah, I want to ask you, Dr. Stevenson, people that don't know a whole lot about the Rodney King incident, that maybe, and most of them will remember that famous press conference where he came out the second or third day after the civil unrest and made that passionate plea asking people, why can't we all just get along? Many people will remember Rodney King by that. But from a historian standpoint, what do you think is the most important thing that we should remember and take away from 1991, the beating of Rodney King, and then 1992, the civil unrest in LA?
Well, I think what people should remember is that this is a long history. It didn't begin in 1991, and it certainly didn't end in 1992. And so if we look at Los Angeles, if we look at the nation, it has been a place where domestic terrorism, even in the form of the police, have been used against bodies of color, whether we're talking about the 1871 massacre of Chinese people in Los Angeles, whether or not we're talking about the 1943 zoot suits against Latinx peoples, and other people were wearing that clothing at the time. The 1951 Christmas scandal where the police beat up several Latinx people, until we get 1965 Watts, and then of course 1991 and 1992. But beyond that, there's been so much more since that time, up until today, up until, literally where we are today, and where we're finding out what's happening to Indigenous people, what's continue to happen to Black people, to Latinx people, to Chinese people, to Asian American people. And so this is a long trajectory of violence that's been institutionalized in policing institutions. And in the court system, the 14th Amendment say that speaks that we are all equal before the law. The 14th Amendment has not been enforced as it should be, and it has been enforced very unevenly, and it's never been equally applied to people of color. And that's what we have to remember. It's not about one incident that occurs. You could choose any major city, many minor cities, even countrysides, and you can see this kind of institutionalization of inequality in our criminal justice system. That's what we need to remember. That's what we need to work to eradicate.
All right, we've got to leave it there. Thank you so much, Professor Stevenson and Professor Johnson, for joining us and giving us some insight. So much to think about, and obviously so much to do. So thank you for your voices and the great work that the both of you are doing on this important issue.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, can't have this conversation about what happened to Rodney King without talking about the legal system. We have alluded to that trial that happened of those 4 officers and the acquittal in the Simi Valley courtroom, some 30 miles outside of Los Angeles. So my next guests are both law professors. First joining me is Professor Jody Armour. He is a law professor at USC, and he's a race scholar. His latest book is In Theory, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and the Law. Also joining me is Professor Margalynne Armstrong. She is a law professor at Santa Clara University School of Law. She is the author of Protecting Privileged Race, Residents, and Rodney King, an article that was published in the Minnesota Journal of Law and Inequality. Good morning, and thanks so much to both of you for joining me. First, I want to ask you, Professor Armour, tell us what kind of flack do you get about the name of your book? And when you say the name of your book, since we're all, in this critical cancel culture where anything that anyone says that, goes against the grain, you're instantly canceled on social media. So you write this book with this very provocative title. Tell us what happens when you speak the name of that book to the public.
Yeah, well, I had a hard time getting it published first. I had to find a publisher who was intellectually adventurous enough to take the risk that you have to take. I tell my students that I write with my head in the lion's mouth, and I want them to practice with their heads in the lion's mouth. You have to take risks. And this N word is unsayable, transgressive. It has deep roots in lots of racial pain and suffering by Black folks. It has deep roots in slavery. And so I recognize the venom, the reservoir of venom that's in this word. And I also, though, recognize that Black artists and writers have taken this word and inverted it, transvalued it. People like The Last Poets, Pac, Nas, Cube, Hove, Kendrick Lamar. You go down, there's a long list of of Black artists and writers who've said we are going to find ways to bond, to say that we can use the word, unlike others who aren't part of our group, we can use the word with self-referential irony. And that's the difference. That's why not everyone gets to use the word, right? We can use it with self-referential irony. We can say that when someone like Pac says, my N-words, we the last ones left. When he talks about my N-words, he's saying, I recognize that we belong to a category in America that's been dehumanized, that's been called the N-words. But you know what? I'm going to use it as a term of endearment, a term of solidarity, to bond with you, to say in our oppression, we can find transformation and transcendence even, right? So it is a loaded word, I recognize, but I think it's important for us to engage that conversation.
No, and thank you for that. And obviously, I assume that was exactly what you were trying to do. And clearly, with that provocative title, I'm sure lots of folks in your classroom and outside of your classroom, readers are having that conversation. And that really, gives us a nice segue. I assume that was exactly what you were trying to do. And clearly, with that provocative title, that gives us a great segue, Professor Armstrong, into legally the case, Rodney King's case, the outrage that we saw in 1992. A lot of it is due to what happened in that courtroom in Simi Valley when that predominantly all-white jury determined that those 4 officers that we saw with our very eyes, brutalized Rodney King, that they were not guilty. They weren't guilty of using excessive force. They weren't guilty of assaulting him. We saw a very different outcome just last month in Minneapolis Superior Court when that jury determined that Derek Chauvin was in fact guilty of murder of George Floyd. What do you think the difference is?
Well, they moved the Rodney King trial from Los Angeles to Simi Valley in order to reduce the bias against the police. That move increased the bias against Rodney King, the victim of the crime. The trial in Minneapolis was more of the constituency that lived around George Floyd, that was in the city, and it was a racially mixed jury. There was a little mixture on the Simi Valley jury, but there were no African Americans on the Simi Valley jury. And so you had a situation in Los Angeles and Simi Valley in which you took the trial to the people who the police had been hired to protect. And one of the ways that they protect them was by keeping people of color out of Simi Valley. And that whole training of the police are like the thin blue line between the suburbs and the city served to protect the police when the police were being judged, because the jury was told to use a standard of what's reasonable, but the standard is what's reasonable to the police. And the police had been trained to essentially look for people who were out of place and keep them in their place. And then with respect to the events that happened to Rodney King, the reaction of the police in encountering one of these people that they have really been trained to always suspect of wrongdoing. And in fact, because he was speeding, he was doing something wrong, but there's no accounting for the fact that the people in cities, are African-American people particularly, are afraid of the police. They know what the police do to African-Americans. They certainly knew, Rodney King certainly knew, because LA was the place where you had the Kerner report that talked about the fact that police brutality was systemic, and it was the way that police were trained to deal with people of color, particularly African-American men. So you have a jury that is trying to evaluate the people who they see as their protectors from people like Rodney King.
And Professor Armstrong just made reference to LA's long history that predated Rodney King's beating. But if you pick up LA Times newspaper today, some of those same systemic issues that plagued the police department 30 years ago are, written about on the daily in Los Angeles papers. And I'm sure if you pick that paper up in, Minneapolis or other cities across the country, you would be reading the same headlines. How is it that we're 30 years after Rodney King still talking about Black men in particular being disproportionately stopped and harassed by police, being unfairly identified as gang members, and some of the same harassment that was happening 30 years ago? That here we are 30 years later, and in some ways it's like nothing has changed.
Yeah, I wrote a book in 1997 titled Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, The Hidden Cost of Being Black in America. And now, all these years later, seems ain't nothing changed but what year it is. In terms of what I was writing about then and what's going on now. Then I was writing about racial profiling and the problems that come up with it, and unconscious bias, and structural and systemic racism. And here we are still dealing with the festering legacy of slavery, and then Jim Crow and everything else we've been going through. And I think the difference now is we recognize Rodney King gave rise to a moment. Right? It was let's call it an urban conflagration, to take a neutral term, right? I see it as an uprising or revolt, but many see it as something else, so a riot or what have you. But what we've seen is that moment did not result in lasting change, that Rodney King moment. But with the advent of Black Lives Matter and the procession of hashtags that we saw come as a result of that movement, we saw an infrastructure develop, of activists who 2014, 15, 16, when the cameras went away, they kept building the sinews of connection, kept getting stronger until, they were here in LA, for example, in 2018, 19, going in front of Jackie Lacey's office every Wednesday saying you got to hold police accountable for over 3 years, until that George Floyd moment came along and it was able to ride that infrastructure that was already there and lead to the greatest kind of social movement that we've seen, at least in my lifetime, before our own eyes. And that is the movement that has sprung and distinguishes it from the Rodney King moment. And what this movement has recognized is that we must, if we want to stop waking up to this racial injustice Groundhog Day that we keep waking up to over and over, we must defund the police. We can't just train it out of them. We can't give them implicit bias training. We tried that. We tried a technological fix with cameras, body cameras. We tried de-escalation training, community policing. They had all that going on in Minneapolis and more. And you still see what happens. So what we need to do, increasingly we recognizing, thanks to this movement that we're in the midst of now, we have to minimize contacts between police and members of stereotyped communities like Black communities. Minimizing those contacts means unbundling the police, not reallocating resources so that we don't look at jails as receptacles of our social failures, pull back the social safety net, and then put police in that tough position of having to move people to those jails, those receptacles of our social failures, since we stopped investing in education and health and all the rest. So fortunately, this movement has led us to that conclusion. Get them out of traffic stops. Why are they even involved in traffic stops? Unless somebody is doing something reckless, why are you pulling over Dante Wright for having an air freshener on his rearview mirror, or expired tags for that matter? Why? Because think about how many of these incidents involve traffic stops, whether it's Sandra Bland, Sam DuBose, Walter Scott, even Rodney King for that matter. We don't have to have them in those situations. So that's what we've learned from this movement and distinguishes it from the Rodney King moment.
And really interesting point about, you mentioned, Professor Armour, defund the police. it's been a lightning rod, like the title of your book is another one of those phrases that creates a lot of conversation. Lots of folks, entrenched position. There's a USA Today poll out that said that only 1 in 5 Americans support defunding the police, and only 28% of African Americans support the movement. Obviously, a much bigger conversation than we're going to have today. But I do want to end with you, Dr. Or Professor Armstrong, asking you the question about the legal system, because we saw in Rodney King, there was the acquittal in the first trial. Then the feds came in, filed civil rights violations, and then 2 of those officers were eventually found guilty, did serve some jail time. 2 were acquitted. We now have a Justice Department under Joe Biden with Margalynne that says they're going to get more involved in enforcing civil rights. They're doing these pattern and practice investigations of police departments around the country that have been stopped under Donald Trump. I just, as a lawyer myself, I guess I'm asking you as a professor of law, are we relying too heavily on the criminal justice system to solve the problem of police brutality? Because we sit around and we wait with bated breath that one, there is a prosecution. You know, we're in the streets protesting, begging, pleading with the prosecutors to even file charges. And then we go through this trial process and we're on pins and needles hoping that a jury is going to find this conduct reprehensible and illegal. And then we're now, like in the case of Derek Chauvin, just hoping and praying that this judge in Minneapolis on June 25th is going to hand down a sentence that's, you know, is proportionate to the crime that we witnessed in that George Floyd video. Are we just, you know, putting way too much emphasis on this legal process to rectify this entrenched problem that we have in this country in terms of the way police treat Black folks particularly?
Well, absolutely, because the way that you end up in the legal system is by really hurting or killing someone. And that should be a fail. That should be considered to be a failure of the police effort, because the police are not supposed to be killing the public. Now, we have a lot of complications here because we have a public that's equipped with guns in ways that really distort the perceptions of the police because of the possibility that they're going to be killed. But we have to start by saying, when a police officer kills someone, when they kill someone unarmed, the police officer has essentially failed their job, and they should no longer be allowed to be a police officer. You know, just having a standard where the police believe that ending an arrest or ending an encounter with death is anyway acceptable, we have a flawed system. It really will result in what we have: police being afraid of people and police using their guns to kill people, whether the people are armed or not. So there has to be a reframing of what is an acceptable result when the police encounter people and are confronting them. I think Professor Armour is completely right in saying, why are the police handling traffic stops? Police should absolutely be the last resort in mental health situations. They're just not equipped to deal with mental health issues. And so we need to at least conceptualize what the police are supposed to do and where they fit into a larger structure of dealing with societal problems. And these problems have occurred because we don't put enough of an investment in mental health, in the social safety net, in any of the things that can help prevent people being in these situations, which we have criminalized. So that's another problem, because we've criminalized so many different activities that the police can pretty much stop anybody for anything. And the Supreme Court has said that.
Yeah.
So they're doing too much.
I'm running out of time, but Professor Armour, one last question for you, just to bring us back to Rodney King, since we are talking about the anniversary of his death and the 30 years since the civil unrest. If the case were tried today, Rodney King's case, and not Rodney King, but those 4 officers that beat Rodney King brutally on that video that we watched, if those 4 officers were tried today, do you think there'd be a different outcome?
Not necessarily at all. I think that they very well could be the same outcome, because I remember Walter Scott, the case of Walter Scott, in which we all saw Walter Scott getting shot 6 times in the back on another video, with another video, right? And the jury deadlocked the first time around, right? And there are other cases that we can go to. Philando Castile, there's a lot of damning fact patterns out there that juries have looked at, even with compelling ocular proof, a compelling video proof, and have said this officer, thanks to 30 years of Law and Order shows and a lot of kind of putting a halo on officers and demonizing, monsterizing Black people, but that combination of things have led a lot of jurors to come to the jury box and give an enormous presumption to the officers of goodwill, an enormous presumption of wickedness to people that they killed who are Black. And I'm not sure we'd have very much of a difference.
Wow. All right, we've got to leave it there. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Armour and Professor Armstrong. Thank you again for the work that both of you are doing. I got to get a copy of that book, Professor Armour. I've got to add that to my collection. That's going to be the next thing I do after this show today. But again, thanks so much for joining me this morning. All right. Wow, what a provocative show. I want to thank all of my guests, and thanks to you for joining, and thanks for all of your insightful comments and questions. You're going to see, particularly if you live in California, a lot of coverage over the next couple of days on the anniversary of Rodney King's death. It's been 9 years. He did die of natural causes. He was found dead in a swimming pool in his backyard. And there was an autopsy, and there was no foul play with respect to his death. And as you heard his daughter, Lora, say that he was never, ever, ever the same after that vicious beating that was caught on videotape in 1991. No one, would, recover from such a vicious beating. And he did have permanent brain damage. And she's absolutely correct. The media villainized Rodney King even after that encounter with LA police officers. And it's shameful. And I think Professor Armour is absolutely correct. Even if that trial happened today, there's no guarantee that those 4 officers would be held accountable. And that is incredibly shameful and a sad commentary on the state of our legal system in the United States. But just some quick words to live by before I get out. Those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. Sadly, it doesn't look like many of the men and women who work as sworn police officers around this country learned very much from Rodney King's vicious attack in 1991. You need only look at the state of policing today and the thousands of Black men and women who have been brutalized and murdered by police across this country. When we think of that long list of fathers and brothers, sons and daughters whose lives have been snuffed out by rogue cops over the last 30 years, by police officers who refuse to accept the humanity of Black lives, it seems that we have learned very little from our history. And as that saying goes, we are doomed, and we are sadly repeating it. And despite Rodney King's passionate plea of 30 years ago, it doesn't look like we have figured out how to all get along. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. And remember, we are all in this together.